Welcome to the official VFC fan club. Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and seriously, could someone other than VFC make interesting stuff for us to review? This is getting a little one note. Well, VFC's been getting into the retro AR game, hot on the heels of fixed carry handle rifles becoming cool again, thanks social media. But in addition to gas versions of the well-known Colt 733 and XM147 carbines, they've also made the first ever reproduction of the Colt CGL-4 or XM148 grenade launcher. While the real XM148 was a dismal failure, I'm always curious to see whether an airsoft reproduction of an unsuccessful firearm carries forward its flaws, or if it has positive elements that are more relevant to airsoft. Today we're going to walk through the XM148's history, the VFC design, how it works, and most importantly, how it compares to the ubiquitous M203 for airsoft use. The 40mm grenade concept was initially designed by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office in the early 1950s. It was intended to be fired from underslung multi-shot grenade launchers mounted to the flechette-firing Special Purpose Individual Weapon, or SPIW, prototypes. Ultimately, the SPIW program never produced a viable rifle due to excessive weight, but the repeating 40mm grenade launcher concept was felt to have merit. So, Springfield Arsenal designed a 3-shot grenade launcher designated the T148, but it failed in testing due to reliability and accuracy issues. Springfield decided to go back to an earlier single-shot break-action prototype using a further iteration on the cartridge, and the package was ultimately adopted as the M79 grenade launcher. The M79 was first issued in 1961 and was well regarded by troops, but by 1963 the Army was already looking for a replacement. The M79 was a stopgap because it was known that the low fire rate of a single-shot grenade launcher combined with the minimum arming distance of 40mm grenades would leave an M79 operator vulnerable at short range. M79 gunners were typically only issued a Colt 1911 as a sidearm, and this was deemed insufficient in situations where the grenade launcher could not be used, while the rifle grenades that the M79 replaced still allowed the normal use of a rifle. While this was all going on, the AR-15 was concurrently undergoing combat trials. The Army recognized that the AR could finally fulfill the SPIW concept, minus the flechette ammunition with a more conservative launcher, and so in 1963 proposals were solicited for an underslung single-shot grenade launcher. Colt, Springfield, Ford, and AAI all responded. Of these, the Colt and AAI prototypes had the most merit, with Colt designing a new launcher from scratch and AAI basically resubmitting a modified version of the simple launcher that they had designed for the SPIW program. But AAI's design still used the prototype grenade cartridge from the SPIW trials, while Colt's used the same 40x46mm as the M79, and so in 1964 Colt won the contract. The CGL-4, now type-designated XM148, went from contract acceptance to finalized design in just 47 days, and initial delivery began in 1965 for testing. In December of 1966, the first batch of XM148s reached Vietnam for combat trials by the Army Concept Team, where it performed, well, like a weapon designed in just 47 days. I won't get into the specifics just yet, but basically the reception was so overwhelmingly negative that the Army Concept Team recommended the XM148 be removed from service altogether and a replacement be developed immediately. So, just 6 months after its deployment, Army began a new program to replace the XM148. Colt offered to redesign the launcher at no cost to the government, but at this point Army was done with Colt and again solicited designs from the defense community. This time the winner was AAI's design, pretty much the same single-shot launcher they had originally developed for SPIW, which had competed against the CGL-4, but this time rechambered to the standardized 40x46mm. The XM148 was removed from Army service in late 1967, and the AAI design would go on to be adopted as the M203. But since AAI, an R&D firm, was unable to sustain the production volume that the Army required, the primary production contract for the M203 eventually wound up back at Colt. While the XM177 had only a short service life in Army use, it was fielded by the Air Force for longer and by Australia in a variety of configurations, but by the late 1970s all but a handful were scrapped. And that's the end of the XM148, so let's take a look at the VFC rendition. VFC has included the hardware needed to mount the launcher to either an M16 or an XM177E2, and on this initial batch at least, have also included a replica of the heat shield used on the M16. So we'll start by examining the XM148 itself, and then we'll walk through mounting it and talk about practicality. First off, the externals. This launcher is almost entirely aluminum, although many of the small parts are parkerized steel. It has a nice matte black finish that matches the real thing pretty well, but we've noticed it started to wear easily at contact points such as on the barrel. The barrel itself does have a bit of play in the body, but not significant. On the right side of the launcher, there's a steel sling swivel, which has an appropriate rubberized coating, and it's held to the launcher by a steel screw. Behind the swivel, we find the identification markings, and note that these launchers do have unique serial numbers. On the opposite side is Colt's usual marking, and ahead of that is a reproduction of the Department of Defense acceptance stamp. These were used on all issued rifles and launchers during the time period that the XM148 was in production, but are rarely seen, even in period photos, because the paint just easily wore off in field conditions. The VFC stamp survives the fingernail test, which is better than the real thing. Above, we have the mounting bracket. Unlike with M203s, there's just one bracket used for both rifles and carbines, and it has a small range of adjustment just due to the size of the mounting holes. Underneath is a cosmetic spring tab replicating what was likely a spring tensioner on the real launcher. On the underside is the latching mechanism, and again, this spring tab on the front is purely cosmetic. Above the locking mechanism is the sight mount, which we'll talk more about later. On top is the extractor hook, though this isn't the original because, well, we'll get to that. The rear bracket was slightly molested to get it to fit on a real spec barrel nut. Out of the box, it fit fine on an AEG, but it was just a little too tight on the ViperTech. A bit of filing was all it took to clear enough space, and all my sins are hidden once the slip ring is installed. Then at the back, we have all the primary controls. It has a steel toggle safety, which prevents the launcher from firing when engaged. In the middle is the cocking lever, which, since this is a push-pin system, is purely cosmetic. And on the right side, we have the firing mechanism, which consists of a steel sear that actually fires the system, and a long steel trigger linkage that actuates said sear. The trigger is supposed to be able to rotate 180 degrees, but on this one it gets too tight once rotated partway, which we'll address in a moment. Overall, this is a good-looking replica made from all steel and aluminum, so we aren't particularly concerned with durability, and we expect that Vietnam reenactors will be pleased with the external quality, though as mentioned, the finish will start to wear quickly. Operation is very simple. Pushing in this button, similar to a 1911 grip safety, allows the handle to swivel down, which unlocks the action and allows the barrel to slide forwards. While the barrel is forwards, this handle stays locked open so it can't be accidentally reset. Insert a shell and push it to the front. To close the action, pulling back on the handle causes a plunger to press against the housing, which allows the handle to swivel up and close to lock up the action. Pull the trigger or press the sear directly to fire the shell, then unlock the barrel again to open it and drop the spent shell. Simple. Well, that's the idea anyways. There were a few issues with it, so let's start talking internals. First things first, the original extractor didn't protrude very far into the barrel. This is fine with a real shell that only leaves the base once fired, but with longer airsoft shells, the rim tends to slip out from under the extractor while opening the barrel. We tried bending the extractor to get a bit better grip, and it broke. So we replaced the extractor with a bent piece of spring steel, which is able to protrude farther into the action and improves the reliability of extraction. It can still slip off if the shell is long enough, but it works much more reliably. Next, the safety was a bit too weak out of the box and was too easy to accidentally toggle. Removing a single roll pin frees the safety internals, and stretching the safety spring increases the force required to actuate the safety. On the trigger linkage, taking out this grub screw frees the trigger. There's an O-ring that's supposed to tension the trigger so that it takes some force to rotate, but the trigger itself is threaded out of the box, which makes it get tighter as it turns. We suggest drilling out the trigger so that the screw can pass through it freely, then lubricate the O-ring, threadlock the screw, reinstall, and tighten until the trigger rotates with the right amount of friction. Lastly, we found that out of the box, the trigger actually couldn't be pulled far enough to fire some 40mm shells, so we had to modify the firing mechanism. Unfortunately, we were unable to actually extract the striker mechanism as it appears to be tightly threaded into the body of the launcher. If you manage to take this part out, let us know if there's something we've missed. Instead, we modified the sear system to allow it to travel farther. This required cutting out a wider channel on the guide and deepening the forked groove that the trigger linkage rides in. With that done, the trigger can now reliably pull far enough to set off any shells we've tested. Alright, now that it works as it should, let's get it mounted up on the M16. The system comes with an additional spacer bracket for the XM177, but we will not be using it for an M16, and instead of the screws it comes with, we'll be using shorter ones. The bracket goes directly over the barrel, and we add a thin piece of styrene as a spacer to tension it properly. We push forwards on the bracket while pulling back on the launcher and tighten the short screws, and then the launcher is secure. Now we can install the heat shield by sliding it over the front bracket, and this is why we needed short screws, because the VFC ones stick out the bottom without the extra spacer. And then secure it with the slip ring. One thing to note while we're here is that the barrel sits behind the front sling swivel mount on an AR, so the sling swivel should be removed to prevent an oopsie. We've opted to use the very early style roll pin rather than the more common rivet so that it can be more easily removed and reinstalled. And that's the launcher mounted up, but we've got one more piece to add. The launcher comes with its sight, which slides onto the mounting bracket. It is now, bizarrely, able to swivel and slide into multiple positions, but honestly we can't find a reason for any of them besides this raised position for general use, or maybe the lowered position for firing from cover. Regardless, the sight itself has a nice clicking adjustment for distance, or can be adjusted more smoothly by pushing the unlocking lever. Windage and elevation controls for zeroing on the rear aperture, and there's additionally a coarse adjustment on the front sight which we speculate is intended to adjust for wind. This is all very cool, but the sight has a ton of wobble. Multiple parts being held by spring tension, but not tightly enough to prevent movement. We've tested out adding shims to take up the slack, but getting this to hold securely and consistently might be a tall order. Ultimately, for airsoft use, we imagine that more informal aiming techniques might work better. Anyways, loading and firing is pretty straightforward once mounted up to the rifle. Opening the launcher is easy, as is loading a shell and closing it up. The safety is easy to access and check status by feel. While the trigger pull is extremely long, it is a light and smooth pull and does reliably trigger shells. With the new extractor, shells drop reliably in any orientation, and retaining shells is no problem. There are two things I quite like ergonomically. First, the body being a tube, and one of comparable size to round AR handguards, makes it pretty comfortable to grip. The handle for opening and closing the action has a similar feel to a modern stubby foregrip and provides a comfortable surface to pull against, with the protruding spring tab surprisingly not getting in the way. In actual use, I appreciate that the trigger linkage allows me to keep both hands in the normal positions. In fact, I find pulling the trigger in the upright stowed position more comfortable than with it rotated down, so once the safety is disengaged, firing it is just as easy as reaching for the mag release. And, well, that's about it for operation. It's an Airsoft 40mm grenade launcher that uses the same shells as any other launcher. What else is there to talk about? Alright, the reasons this thing failed in real life and whether they apply to Airsoft. So first things first, the real launcher didn't automatically cock the firing pin on loading like most modern launchers. Instead, the operator had to pull the cocking handle, which required a whopping 30 pounds of force. This was slow and tiring and prevented rapid fire. Since that's not necessary on the Airsoft version, it's easier to fire quickly. The real XM148 had issues at the sights losing zero, so kudos on historical accuracy, I guess. Fortunately, the shots taken in Airsoft are shorter range, and we find that using the rifle sights works well enough for shower shells, although with tag-ins it does limit the effective range. The firing mechanism was considered overly complicated and hard to maintain, which tracks with the patent diagram we found. Fortunately, that isn't relevant, since this is a simpler push-pin design. And lastly, the long and exposed trigger linkage was prone to snagging on brush. That is a very relevant concern for Airsoft, and although the stakes are a bit lower, nobody wants to take a point-blank shower shell or tag into the back. Diligent use of the safety will help, or it is possible to do what some MACV SOG personnel did and simply remove the lever, then fire it by pressing on the sear directly. Of course, the elephant in the room is the XM148 successor, the M203, and I just so happen to have a G&P M203, so obviously we had to compare and contrast the two. First things first, this M203 has already been similarly modified to allow the trigger to pull farther and more reliably trigger shells. However, on the M203, this has a side effect of rendering the safety non-functional, so having a functional safety is nice on the 148. Next, one thing that we noticed in testing is that the XM148 barrel is able to travel farther than the M203's. This helps significantly with loading and unloading exceptionally long shells, such as our homebrew tag-in shells. The actuation mechanisms are pretty similar, but the M203 is a little easier. Just grab, push with the thumb, and slide forwards. The XM148 breaks out into two discrete actions, and we found that simply pushing forwards on the release can sometimes cause it to open, but not actually lock the handle downwards, so then it will not close properly. If you do experience projectile dysfunction or need to load an exceptionally long shell, the 203's barrel can be easily removed. A good yank does it on most Airsoft copies, or you can manually engage the barrel release. The XM148 requires full disassembly of the release mechanism to remove the barrel, so that's not happening on the field. Ergonomically, they're both pretty similar. I like the ribbed grip of the M203, but the pseudo foregrip of the XM148 is pretty nice too. As far as weight, they're virtually identical, handling isn't really any different. The XM148 has a sling swivel built into the side so that it doesn't need a separate adapter or paracord solution, but as mentioned, it also requires the normal sling swivel to be removed to avoid a misfire where the M203 does not, so call that a wash. When it comes to actually aiming the launchers, the M203 wins for sure. The fold-up ladder sight design is quick to bring into action and requires no adjustment for distance. The XM148 sight sticks out to the side and has an unacceptable degree of wobble, and to get it out of the way, you need to remove it entirely. It's pretty similar actually to the M203's quadrant sight, and I've never seen one of those used in Airsoft. Moving back to the firing mechanism, I actually like the concept of the trigger linkage. The M203 requires the operator to move one hand to the magazine to fire, and I find this makes it slower to bring into action and less accurate during a limited shot opportunity. We've been experimenting with low spread 40mm shells, and I found that with the M203, I sometimes pull off target trying to get a quick shot. But by the same token, I much prefer the short trigger pull of the M203 as it acts directly on the push rod rather than having this complicated linkage. Because 40mm grenades tend to produce higher power the faster the valve is opened, it's necessary to jerk the trigger, and this is a lot easier on the M203. Lastly, one thing that's often annoyed me on the M203 is how the trigger guard protrudes downwards. With a modern magazine grip, it's easy to accidentally hit the trigger guard and deflect it upwards, which blocks the trigger until it can be corrected. While the 148's cocking lever will bruise you if you go a little too high-speed low-drag, that's a you problem rather than something that will impede function of the launcher. With either launcher, if you're using older web gear that forces you to grab the bottom of the mag, it isn't a problem. If you hadn't guessed by now, we're pretty much just nitpicking. The bottom line is that either of these launchers will shoot whatever 40mm grenades you feed them, and the critical flaws of the XM148 largely either weren't carried over to the Airsoft replica or aren't relevant to Airsoft play. If I had to broadly characterize the two, I'd say that the 203 is a little better as a tag-in or football launcher owing to its better sight and speedier reloads, while the XM148 is a little better as an emergency buckshot dispenser because it stays out of the way of using the rifle, but can be brought into action the instant you need it. A few final notes before we close out. First, the metal XM148 heat shield will not fit over an M203, but the M203 heat shield will fit on an XM148. We're not aware of this ever being done in real life, but it looks kinda neat and does provide a better sighting system. Second, like the M203, the XM148 will only fit on a pencil barrel profile without modification, but the collar sits farther back than on an M203, so the XM177E2 is the only carbine with the right cuts for it to fit and retain in position. So all in all, this is a nicely built replica of a relatively unknown grenade launcher. The external quality is excellent as we've come to expect from VFC, and functionally it works comparably to an M203, although it does require some modifications to work with all 40mm shells. The inclusion of the heat shield and separate sight are nice touches, although the amount of wobble in the sight limits its usefulness without substantial modification. And at over $300 USD, well, you can get a GMP M203 plus heat shield for half that cost. Overall, as with VFC's Carl Gustaf we covered previously, we see this as a collector's piece more than a cost-effective skirmish item, particularly since the M203 is already era-appropriate for Vietnam kit. Unlike the Carl Gustaf though, it only takes a little work to make this function as well as a more typical grenade launcher, so the only real drawback is the price. But again, this is a replica that has never existed before, so you'll have to decide for yourself how much uniqueness is worth. Well, as always, if you have any questions, please let us know down in the comments, and thanks for watching.